The judge's face hardened as she glared at the ceremonial rifle. "Remove that weapon immediately. This is a court of law." But when the royal guard finally spoke, the entire courtroom fell silent, then rose to their feet in respect. So what exactly did he say? Before we reveal that moment, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from today. Now, let's dive into this remarkable story. The scent of Brasso hung thick in the prep hall of Hyde Park Barracks. It was just past 6:30 in the morning, and most of the guardsmen were already polishing their boots, creasing tunics, or adjusting chin straps on the bearskin caps that would soon catch the flash of 1,000 tourist cameras. Near the rear bench, working in silence, Sergeant Alarin Stormbast methodically ran his cloth over the barrel of his rifle. At 38, Stormbast wasn't polishing for the crowds today. He was polishing for court. The envelope had arrived the previous afternoon, folded once, no wax seal, just a tight crease, and his name typed clean across the top, Sergeant A. Stormbast. Inside lay a summons to Southwark Crown Court, with a simple allegation, inappropriate conduct during ceremonial intervention. He'd read it twice, once like a soldier, once like a civilian. It hadn't made more sense either time. Corporal Daniels, passing by with a tin of polish, glanced over his shoulder. "Trouble?" "Court date," Alarin replied calmly, his voice barely rising above the background chatter. "For what?" Alarin didn't answer. He just kept polishing. 2 weeks earlier, the procession down Constitution Hill had been going smoothly. Tourists filming, children waving flags, police on horseback flanking the route. Then, as if from nowhere, a man with a GoPro rig and the swagger of someone who thrived on controversy had darted forward, shouting about ripping the chains of tradition. He'd grabbed at the reins of one of the mounted officers' horses, spooking the animal into a half-rear. Alarin had broken formation. 3 precise steps, rifle lowered, not as a threat, but as a shield between the man and the panicking horse. He hadn't said a word, hadn't raised the stock. Just blocked the man's forward movement with the flat side of the barrel. The officer had regained control. The crowd calmed. No one was injured. Or so he'd thought. It turned out the man, an online personality named Callum Gresh, had posted a video that same day. "Guard points gun at me for saying the truth." It racked up 500,000 views in just 48 hours. His legal team followed with formal action. The official accusation? Public intimidation with a ceremonial firearm. The phrasing alone would have been funny if it hadn't been printed on official letterhead. Still, Alarin had nodded when briefed by his commanding officer. "Understood, sir." There would be no exemption. The court insisted he appear in the same uniform worn during the incident. That included the rifle. A decision that puzzled the Crown but was ultimately allowed, with the caveat that the weapon remain empty, shouldered and properly escorted. Palace Command signed off with minimal comment. Alarin wasn't rattled. Hadn't been since Helmand. Some of the younger guardsmen whispered about it, the old war stories, that Stormbast had once carried a wounded interpreter across a minefield, that he'd survived an IED strike that had split his unit, that after discharge from the paras, he'd joined the household division not to escape combat, but to preserve what steadied him: structure, ceremony, silence. He didn't talk about those things. He didn't need to. Now, facing a courtroom instead of a crowd, he polished the barrel one last time. Not to impress a judge, but to honour the weapon itself, to make it gleam, not as a symbol of fear, but as one of tradition, a presence without escalation. "Stormbast," called the adjutant from the hallway. "Escorts ready. Cars waiting." Alarin rose, his scarlet tunic knife-sharp, white gloves spotless. The lads in the barracks used to joke he never smiled unless inspecting metal. Today was no different. He hoisted the rifle carefully onto his shoulder. The sling was tight, regulation, perfect. He gave no farewell, no commentary, no speech. Just one nod. And then he stepped toward the waiting car, not to defend himself, but to defend something older, something heavier. The silence behind him as he walked out seemed louder than any applause. Southwark Crown Court had seen its share of spectacles over the years, celebrity cases, political scandals, activist protests. But today, the atmosphere felt different. Not loud, not hostile, just tense, like the air itself was holding its breath. People had queued from early morning. There was no jury. This was a procedural hearing, but the public gallery was packed nonetheless. Legal observers, anti-monarchist campaigners, journalists with half-charged phones waiting for a quote, and scattered among them the odd pair of tourists who'd recognized the man from the viral video and wanted a better look at the one who dared move. The video had been clipped and captioned to fit a narrative. Royal Guard uses gun to silence free speech. What it didn't show was the panicked rearing of the horse, the scream from a child nearby, the way the officer had nearly lost control. It certainly didn't show Alarin using the rifle like a shield, not a weapon, but a wall. That part hadn't gone viral. When the courtroom doors opened at 9:58 a.m., a hush fell over the room. It wasn't the judge, it wasn't the prosecution, it was him. Sergeant Alarin Stormbast stepped inside with 2 escort officers, the ceremonial rifle slung across his back in a brown leather strap, perfectly aligned with the creases in his scarlet tunic. His boots caught the light like polished obsidian. The bearskin cap, tall, imposing and silent, added the final line to a silhouette generations in the making. Even the gallery's more cynical occupants hesitated. "He actually brought it," someone whispered near the back. "No way they let him in armed." "It's not loaded," muttered another. "It's just a symbol." "But that's the point, isn't it?" came the reply. Alarin gave no sign he heard them. He moved with the kind of stillness that had made him a ghost in the Helmand nights. One step at a time, each heel perfectly placed, as if the courtroom floor were parade ground stone. At the defence table, his solicitor, Regina Croft, rose to acknowledge him. Alarin gave her a silent nod, then sat, keeping his posture straight, rifle still diagonally across his back. On the opposite bench, the prosecution shuffled papers theatrically. Thomas Radley adjusted his robe and leaned toward his assistant with a look of smug disbelief. "Is this a courtroom or a costume party?" he murmured. "We're not a parade ground." Radley was young for a Crown barrister, but with an ego that aged him 20 years. He had the confidence of someone who believed he could make a career off this hearing alone, maybe even snag a soundbite for Sky News before lunch. And the sight of a rifle, ceremonial or not, was all the ammunition he needed to fuel his case. That the monarchy's traditions were outdated, dangerous, and intimidating in modern civic life. The clerk glanced up nervously from her notes, her gaze lingering on the rifle. Alarin didn't flinch. At exactly 10:02 a.m., the side door opened. "All rise," the bailiff called. Judge Margaret Downing entered. She was known in legal circles for her sharp eyes and sharper sentences, unmoved by emotion, immune to theatre. She walked briskly to the bench, scanning the room once as she adjusted her robe. Then she saw him. Her gaze caught on Alarin's uniform, travelling from the scarlet tunic to the bearskin cap, then freezing when it reached the rifle. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes narrowed perceptibly. "Why?" she asked, before even sitting down. "Is he armed in my courtroom?" Dead silence enveloped the room. You could have heard a pin drop. Radley rose instantly, ready to pounce, but the defence beat him by half a second. "Your Honour," Regina Croft said calmly, "Sergeant Stormbast is in full ceremonial uniform, as mandated by both the court request and his station. The rifle is non-functional and was approved for presence under strict escort protocol by Palace Command." Judge Downing didn't look satisfied, not one bit. "This is a court of law," she replied, each word sharp as cut glass, "not a battlefield." Alarin remained seated, still silent, still unmoving. But if anyone had looked close enough, they might have seen it. The faintest shift in his shoulders, not defiance. Readiness. Judge Downing didn't sit right away. She remained standing behind the bench, eyes fixed on the man in red, seated before her, specifically on the rifle strapped neatly across his back. Her tone was not raised, but it had the precise edge of steel honed for the purpose of slicing through pretense. "Sergeant Stormbast," she said flatly, "this is not a military tribunal. This is Southwark Crown Court. Weapons are not permitted here." Alarin rose to his feet in one fluid motion. He didn't speak. Regina Croft stood alongside him. "Your Honour, I must respectfully reiterate, this is a ceremonial rifle. It is unloaded, sealed, and presented solely as part of regulation dress. The palace insisted on it." "I don't answer to the palace," Judge Downing replied, her voice cooling several degrees. "I answer to the law. And in my courtroom, decorum comes before theatre. If he's here to defend himself, not perform, then he can do so without that prop." Alarin's voice came low, even. Not loud enough to dominate the room, just enough to be heard. "With respect, ma'am, it's not a weapon. It's a promise." Silence fell again, heavier this time. Even Radley, who had been licking his chops in anticipation of a crossfire, paused. Judge Downing tilted her head slightly. "A promise?" Alarin didn't elaborate. He simply stood there, cap removed, rifle still slung behind him like a cross carried by choice. The gallery stirred. Someone whispered. Someone else cleared their throat too loudly. The judge gave a brief glance to the bailiff, who nodded and took a quiet step forward, restoring the silence with his mere presence. "I will allow its presence," the judge finally said, returning to her seat with a rustle of robes, "pending clarification of its relevance. But, Sergeant," she turned her gaze back to him, "this courtroom operates on truth, not symbolism." Alarin gave a single nod. The judge gestured curtly. "Proceed." Radley stood, chest puffed out like a peacock. It was clear from his first step toward the centre of the floor that he relished the spotlight. "Your Honour, what we have here is a matter not just of protocol, but of public safety. A civilian, my client, was subject to the threat of armed intimidation by a member of a ceremonial military unit during a peaceful event in a public square." He turned toward Alarin, his voice taking on a theatrical quality. This man, dressed as if reenacting a 19th century painting, chose to step out of his role as statue and into that of enforcer. He lifted his rifle in plain view of bystanders and, by his own admission, intervened in a civilian-police interaction. That is not tradition. That is overreach. Radley paced slowly, turning to the judge with practiced intensity. "If we allow ceremonial authority to blur into functional authority, we erode the very distinction between performance and power. The defendant's presence here with that weapon is a continuation of the same posturing, the same psychological intimidation that he enacted on my client that day." He gave a tight smile. "Let's not forget, Your Honour, a firearm is a firearm, even when polished." Judge Downing folded her hands. "Thank you, Mr. Radley." She looked back toward the defence table. "Sergeant Stormbast, you will have your opportunity to speak, but I warn you now, this court does not grant special standing to symbolism, sentiment, or spectacle." Alarin inclined his head slightly. "Understood." For the first time since proceedings had begun, a trace of something flickered across the judge's expression. Not sympathy, not even doubt, but curiosity. She turned to Regina. "Call your witness." And Alarin Stormbast stepped forward, his rifle still resting silently behind him, its weight neither denied nor defended, only carried. Alarin removed his bearskin cap before taking the witness stand, revealing silver-threaded dark hair cropped close to the scalp. As he sat, he placed the rifle beside him, not in defiance, not for display, but upright and resting gently against the wooden panel like a companion that had walked the road with him. He adjusted nothing else. Not his belt, not his posture, not his gaze. Regina Croft stood beside the bench. "State your name and rank for the record." "Sergeant Alarin Stormbast, Household Division, Coldstream Guards." "Tell the court what you witnessed on June the 4th, approximately 3:17 p.m., outside Horse Guards Parade." Alarin's voice was unhurried, every word measured and precise. "Mounted procession was returning to barracks, standard ceremonial path. I was part of the rear escort. Crowds were gathered, light security presence. One individual, adult male, stepped past the rope line and attempted to seize a police horse's reins." He paused briefly, his eyes steady, then continued. "PC Wren, mounted officer, shouted for him to stop. The horse reared slightly. Rider was struggling to maintain control. I assessed the risk of public injury as high." Regina asked, "And what did you do?" "I moved in from the rear left flank, issued a verbal warning, then raised the rifle horizontally across chest height to create a visual barrier between the horse and the man." "Did you make physical contact?" "No." "Did you point the rifle at the man?" "No." "Was it loaded?" "Ceremonial issue, permanently deactivated, sealed bolt, trigger pin removed." There was a rustle of paper from the prosecution table. Radley was preparing his cross, making a show of sorting through his notes. Regina continued. "What happened next?" "The man backed away. Officer regained control of the horse. Crowd calmed. Security arrived. I resumed escort." "Did you exchange words with the man?" "No." "Did he appear injured or distressed?" "Angry, not injured." Regina gave a single nod and turned to the judge. "No further questions." Judge Downing adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Radley?" Radley stood slowly, almost theatrically. "Sergeant Stormbast, you say you raised your rifle not as a threat, but as a shield. But are you trained to use ceremonial equipment in public crowd control?" "I'm trained to prevent escalation with minimal force." "Was there a protocol instructing you to intervene?" "There was a child 4 feet from the horse's front hooves," Alarin said calmly. "My protocol is public safety." Radley narrowed his eyes. "Ah, so you're judge, jury, and peacekeeper now." "I'm none of those. I'm the person who saw something going wrong and stopped it." Radley took 2 slow steps forward, fingers tapping the lectern. "Let's not forget, Sergeant, you're dressed in a uniform meant to represent heritage, not enforcement. You carry that rifle for show, for spectacle, and yet you used it in a moment that blurred tradition with authority. Isn't that dangerous?" Alarin looked at him, expressionless, measured. "That rifle didn't blur anything. It drew a line." "A line," Radley scoffed, "between chaos and control." A hush swept the gallery. Judge Downing's pen stilled mid-note. Radley forced a smirk. "So you admit the gesture was confrontational?" "No," Alarin replied evenly. "It was cautionary." Radley let silence hang, hoping discomfort would do what words couldn't. But Alarin didn't shift, didn't blink, just waited, as if he had all the time in the world, as if he'd stood for hours in far worse places than this courtroom. The prosecutor finally gave a dismissive wave, "But no further questions." The judge leaned slightly forward. "Sergeant, one final clarification. In your own words, why raise the rifle at all?" Alarin didn't hesitate. "Because shouting would have panicked the horse. Because stepping forward with empty hands would have been ignored. Because people in that crowd needed to see a line they shouldn't cross. And because sometimes silence speaks loudest." The judge looked down, then back up. "Understood." She gestured toward the clerk. "Next witness." But just then, from the back of the gallery, a voice called out, calm but clear, "Permission to speak, Your Honour." All eyes turned. And there, standing in uniform blues, was PC Talia Wren. The gallery stirred as the figure in the back stepped forward. PC Talia Wren, Mounted Division, Metropolitan Police. She wasn't in ceremonial dress, but her presence in uniform made its own quiet statement. Dark gloves still in her hands, boots polished to shine. She walked with steady intent down the central aisle, stopping just before the bar. "Your Honour," she said clearly, "I was the officer on the horse that day. If the court would permit it, I'd like to speak." Judge Downing gave a long look, measured, sceptical, and yet not dismissive. "This is unscheduled," the prosecutor muttered, already half rising from his seat. Downing silenced him with a glance that could have frozen the Thames. "Miss Wren, are you here in official capacity?" "I came as a witness. I wasn't subpoenaed, but I saw the papers this morning. I saw my name mentioned, and I couldn't just stay home." The judge looked toward the defence, who nodded. Then she leaned back and said simply, "Proceed." Talia stepped into the box. There was no pomp, no practiced rhetoric, just a straight spine and a voice that didn't waver. "June 4th, Horse Guards Parade. I was riding a mare named Kestrel, young, excitable, still in the final phase of street training. We were on return pass from the ceremonial escort. Sergeant Stormbast was stationed at the rear, a few paces behind the mounted file. She glanced at the prosecutor, then the judge. There was a man in the crowd. You've seen the video. You've read his testimony. What it doesn't show is the panic. You can't see how fast the crowd shifted when the horse reared. You can't hear the gasps. You don't feel how the reins twisted in my hands when he lunged for them." Her voice dipped slightly, a crack in the professional veneer. "Kestrel spooked. I lost control for maybe 3 seconds, maybe less. That's all it takes for a mounted injury to happen." Her front leg clipped the barrier. Her flank turned toward a small girl near the edge. Too close. She paused, breathing in through her nose. And then I saw a figure move forward. Not rush, not shout, just step. Rifle raised, not pointed, just held across like a barricade. The horse stopped. The man backed off. I regained control. No one was hurt. The judge asked, "Did the sergeant speak?" "Not a word." "Did he use the rifle aggressively?" Talia shook her head. It wasn't about aggression. It was about presence. Prosecutor Radley finally stood. "Miss Wren, while we respect your service, this court needs to evaluate the legality of the sergeant's conduct, not the sentiment. You weren't called as a witness. You're offering unsolicited opinion." Downing didn't blink. "She's offering first-hand account. I'll allow it." Radley scowled, sitting back down with a barely concealed huff. Talia continued, "I've worked mounted patrol for 8 years. I've done ceremonial, protests, crowd control, you name it. I've had plenty of people intervene, shout, overreach, panic. Most of them made things worse. Sergeant Stormbast didn't. He calmed a situation without making it worse. That's rare. That's judgment." She looked directly at the judge. "If he hadn't stepped in, I believe that girl would have been trampled. I believe we'd be talking about a hospital visit, or worse." The judge nodded slowly. "Thank you, Officer Wren." Talia stepped down without ceremony, returned to the gallery. The room was silent again, not out of tension now, but out of clarity. Even Radley didn't bother objecting again. Alarin didn't turn to look at her. He didn't move at all, but in the gallery, someone whispered, "That changes everything." And for once, no one whispered back in disagreement. The judge called for a 10-minute adjournment. Court officers escorted the barristers out, and the chatter in the gallery rose again, subdued but tense. Some were whispering about PC Wren's testimony. Others were speculating whether the judge would hold Alarin in contempt for defying her initial order to disarm. But Alarin Stormbast remained seated at the defence table, spine straight, gloved hands folded over one knee. His rifle leaned beside him, the polished wood stock catching the ceiling lights like a quiet rebuke to every cynical assumption in the room. When court reconvened, the room settled faster than before. Even the gallery felt more reverent, as if they knew something significant was about to happen. Radley shuffled his papers more aggressively than necessary. The clerk looked up at the bench, waiting for direction. Judge Downing entered, this time with a much slower pace. She sat and didn't speak right away. Her gaze moved across the courtroom, plaintiff, defence, gallery, before finally resting on Alarin. "This court has reviewed the relevant testimonies," she began, voice steady. "We have considered both the letter of the law and the spirit in which it is meant to serve." A pause. "Mr. Radley, you have argued that Sergeant Stormbast presented an armed threat, cloaked in the untouchability of tradition, that his presence constituted intimidation rather than protection." Radley gave a tight nod. "But your argument," she continued, "relies on the assumption that a uniform negates judgment, that a symbol overrides intent, and that ceremonial conduct must bend to personal discomfort." She shifted in her chair slightly, then looked back to Alarin. "I disagree." A ripple moved through the room. The footage, the testimony from PC Wren, and the context of the moment make one thing clear. Sergeant Stormbast acted with restraint, clarity, and purpose. The rifle, unloaded, ceremonial, escorted by regulation, was not used to threaten. It was used to de-escalate, to shield, not to strike. She leaned forward slightly, as if delivering something more personal than legal. "I've sat through dozens of hearings involving excessive force. They often involve shouting, panic, bruises, not silence, not stillness, not a deliberate barrier between chaos and someone else's mistake." Radley shifted uncomfortably, but didn't speak. "This court will not punish judgment exercised in service of public safety." She turned her attention fully to Alarin now. "The charges are dismissed. No reprimand entered into record. No probationary notation." Another pause, then her voice softened. "Sergeant Stormbast. My father served in the Royal Engineers. I remember the weight of his boots in the hallway after his second tour. I remember his stare. He didn't talk much either, but when he stood somewhere, you knew why." The courtroom was silent, utterly, profoundly still. "You reminded me of that today," she said. Alarin blinked once, but gave no visible reaction. The judge straightened her papers. "This court recognises that ceremonial presence, when properly carried, can be a stabilising force, not a disruptive one, and while the law must always guard against intimidation, it must also respect the dignity of those who serve with discipline." She reached for her gavel, then hesitated. The rifle stays, so does the dignity. With a firm strike of the gavel, the courtroom exhaled, quietly, respectfully, like a room that understood something sacred had just occurred and didn't want to ruin it with noise. Radley sat stunned, expression blank. His assistant closed their briefcase without a word. Alarin rose. He gathered his rifle in a smooth motion, never flinching, never rushing. Just the same deliberate steadiness that had defined every moment of his conduct. And then it happened. A slight movement in the gallery. A single person stood, then another, and another. No one clapped at first. They just stood, one by one, until the entire courtroom was on its feet. Then, from the back, a gentle applause began. Not the thunderous kind that follows sports victories, but something more reverent, more meaningful. A recognition of something rare witnessed. Even the court officers didn't move to stop it. Judge Downing watched, her expression softening just enough to be noticed. Alarin stood still, eyes forward, as if he were back on parade. But those who looked closely might have seen the faintest shift in his posture, a subtle acknowledgement of something that couldn't be said with words. He bowed his head slightly toward the bench, turned, and waited for the court officer to guide him out. But Judge Downing didn't signal dismissal just yet. Her gaze lingered on the space where he had stood, as if committing the silhouette to memory. The courtroom emptied slowly. Journalists filed out first, whispering hurriedly into phones and scribbling headlines into notebooks. The plaintiff and his legal team slunk out the side door without fanfare, no handshakes, no final remarks. Even the tourists who had packed the gallery were unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that followed a museum piece too powerful to talk about just yet. Sergeant Alarin Stormbast remained seated until the last of the attendees had gone. Only when the clerk gave him a subtle nod did he rise, shoulders square, rifle slung with ceremonial precision. The click of his boots against the stone echoed faintly as he walked toward the corridor. As he stepped through the heavy oak doors of Southwark Crown Court, the weight of the trial felt like it had already slipped behind him. Just another room of duty, performed without drama. But someone was waiting. It was Judge Margaret Downing. She stood alone, no robes, no gavel, just a long black coat draped over a charcoal grey dress. The lines on her face looked softer now, less drawn with legal burden and more etched with human memory. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she simply extended a hand. Alarin paused. He looked at it for a beat longer than most would. Then he took it, one gloved palm against hers, firm but measured. "I've sat across from arrogance in uniform more times than I can count," she said quietly. "Today, I saw something else." He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was level. "I don't carry it for show." "I believe that now." She let go of his hand, folding her own before her. "You didn't raise it. You didn't need to. But the fact that it was there, I see now that it wasn't for them. It was for you." He tilted his head slightly, acknowledging, but not elaborating. "My father," she continued, "he used to clean his medals in silence. Never wore them in public. Said they weren't for display. But when he walked into a room, even without them, you knew." She looked at him then, not as a judge, not even as a civilian, but as someone who understood what it meant to carry something heavier than metal and cloth. "For what it's worth," she said, her voice a little softer now, "you reminded this room what silence in service looks like." A few seconds passed. Then she added, with the faintest hint of dry humour, "If ever a courtroom forgets that again, let me know. I'll remind them." That drew the slightest shift in Alarin's posture, his version of a smile. Quiet, reserved, but unmistakably there. "I hope it never needs reminding," he said. She stepped aside, giving him space to pass. He nodded once. Then he walked, boots striking the corridor floor like a slow drumbeat, rifle steady on his shoulder, cap shadowing his brow. No audience remained. No press awaited him. No fanfare. Just the quiet corridor of a courthouse, and a silence that finally understood him. If you saw a ceremonial guard enter court with a rifle, would you assume arrogance or discipline? Do you think ceremonial rifles still have a place in modern tradition? And should courts be allowed to override military protocol just because it makes them uncomfortable? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one of them. If this story moved you, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. Don't forget to tap the bell icon so you never miss our daily Royal Guard stories. And if you know someone who thinks discipline is just about rules, share this video with them. Let them see what quiet conviction actually looks like. Our next story is already appearing on your screen. Click it now, and we'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place, with another powerful Royal Guard story.